Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Solve for X podcast. I'm Margarita Quihuis, and I'm the Executive Director of the Peace Innovation Lab at Stanford and the Peace Innovation Institute in The Hague. Today, my guest is Alison Clare Decker, and she is a space lawyer. I have to tell you, I am so excited to talk to her because how cool is this? So Alison has always had a passion for law and for space, which was what led her to join Just Add Astra, an organization focused on bringing human rights to the stars. And I'm not talking Hollywood, I'm talking space, as a legal advisor. And you'll find Alyson right where space law and employment law intersect. Before founding Alison Clare Law in 2021, her legal practice had taken her from an international law firm to several renowned boutique law firms to being vice president of legal affairs for a group of companies with an annual revenue of over $100 million. She's an experienced general counselor, excuse me. She is an experienced general counsel, litigator, board member, executive, space attorney, adjunct law professor, and employment law guru. She's also a member of the advisory board for Smoky Hawk Solutions, an aerospace propulsion startup. So welcome, Alyson. When we met, oh my God, we were on fire when we were talking about space law, and I have all these notes from our talk. So space law. We've got Bezos and Musk and, Richard Branson, and it's sort of like this, all these dudes going out into space, and people are going, what could possibly go wrong with that?
Yeah, and I think that's a concern that a lot of people share in the international law community, and also within Just Add Astra, we're very concerned about human rights issues and really preserving all the things that we fought so hard for on Earth, all the rights we fought, and making sure that those protections continue in space and are to some extent even broadened because of the dangers and also just the reliance you have on others while you're in space.
Yeah, so when we think about, the United States and Russia, certainly they had this moon race in the 60s, right? Who's going to get to the moon first? And the United States won. And that was all funded by government, right?
Right.
And now, and then we kind of set that aside and said, okay, maybe it would be better if we had private companies out pioneering space. But that's problematic in some ways that may not be apparent to the public, because we're thinking, well, they can innovate so much faster and they can make things happen in a way that government couldn't possibly, because we have this perception of government being old and slow. But if we're going to have the future of humanity is going to be off planet, then what do we need to be designing right now? Or what are the challenges so that life off planet is fair and just?
And I think that's the big switch that we see, at least in America, that it's no longer just government controlled space exploration. There's so much of a commercial and private aspect to it. We just had the Inspiration 4 launch, which was basically completely privately funded and mostly privately done, and had private civilians, our first sort of all private mission to space. And I think there's going to be a ton more of those in the future. I think in some of other countries, it is still very government focused, like China's space agency is very government controlled. But I think one of the concerns we have is that we're not ready really for private citizens in space, at least from the legal aspect of things, because we're so used to government controlled space exploration, and also to all of our astronauts being basically government employees. And it's very different when you take that same sort of relationship to the private sphere. So, in a normal employer-employee relationship, you sort of don't rely on your employer for things like usually your housing, your oxygen, your water, your ability to get food. There's this sort of privacy separation as to your health and to things like that. And in space, you're you're going to be relying completely on your employer for things like being able to breathe oxygen, having water to drink, having food, having a habitable atmosphere, having space to move and live in. And so I think the dynamic is changing so much, and the laws just aren't quite there yet. Most of the treaties that we have, the international space treaties, the Outer Space Agreement in particular, it's really focused on states, so the obligations states own to each other, and not so much on the obligations that private companies might own to individuals, or even how individuals can enforce their rights against even states. Like that's not really laid out there. And I think that's the big concern, is you could have these people going up into space, and if they're in horrible conditions, there's not much they can do about that under our current laws.
So, Elon Musk is trying to get to Mars. So who owns Mars?
Well, technically, according to the Outer Space Agreement, which
do Martians own Mars? Does Mars own Mars?
No, Mars gets no say in this, unfortunately. But the way the current agreement is written and it is signed on to by the United States, by Russia, by China, and pretty much all the big spacefaring nations. The original agreement says that nobody owns, or rather a sovereign can't go out. So a state can't go out and claim like the moon is ours or Mars is ours.
So Columbus can't claim the Americas for Spain, right? We don't have that.
Right. So then that comes up the issue of how does this work with private companies? Because they're sort of left out of it. But at the same time, I don't think we're going to be able to go up and claim land in the same way. But at the same time, if you're building a facility upon it, you're basically going to be controlling that space above it, even if you don't own the land. And I think that's a big concern, is right now there's the issue of who controls it and what the rules are. So I think we're going to see something similar to maritime law, where you'll register your spaceship, your installation, your facilities to a specific country, and then sort of follow their rules there. But when you get to Mars, how are you going to enforce rules when the only way to enforce them right now is millions of miles away back on Earth? Or if you have a problem, who are you going to complain to? Because if you're complaining about the person who controls your access to oxygen, to water, to food, basically controls your ability to live, are you going to feel comfortable making a complaint about them?
So this reeks of colonialism, right? It's almost it's the 1600s all over again. And if you think about the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, you're going like, okay, I'm taking people to a foreign land where I control where they live, what they eat, how much they work, do they get rest, all of it. How are we going to prevent it's funny because here on Earth, we're trying to decolonize everything, right? We're very aware of the legacy of colonialism and slavery and all these things. And now that we have that lens, we can't unsee and say, okay, we have to undo that in our institutions, in our culture and everything. And yet we're going to go out into space and we could just reproduce it again. And so if you think about the future of humanity, I saw this thing on Twitter where someone was arguing that Bezos actually had a vision for, he was like the ultimate philanthropist, because he was thinking of humanity, millennia from now, as they're going to survive off planet. But if they're going to survive in a system that could potentially recreate that oppressive
And I think that's a big concern, because we don't even have to look that far back into history to see things like company towns, which were basically impossible for people to get out of, and you became indentured servants. We don't have to even look to historic times. We can see it a lot in domestic workers that work in places like Hong Kong or the Middle East, who are treated to abhorrent conditions. And so I think there's a couple different ways that we can sort of approach it, but I think in part we have to think about how do we preserve the laws that we currently have? So there's already a human rights treaty for migrant workers that sort of entitles them to the same working conditions or the same positive working conditions as other people already within that country who are working. So you basically can't just take advantage of someone because they're from a foreign country. And I think that's a good analogy to what we have in space, because basically everyone's sort of a migrant worker or a seafarer or spacefarer, like they're not tied to their own land at that point. So I think trying to enforce those kind of agreements that we already have, but expanding upon them. And that's one of the things that Just Ad Astra is working on, is trying to create sort of this international sort of minimum requirements for space. So, that you provide water to your employees, you provide food enough to sustain them, you provide them with oxygen, and that you're not charging sort of for these things and creating indentured servants, because a normal person, at least initially, is not going to be able to afford any of these things in space because it's just so costly at the moment. But I do think, and I haven't talked to Elon Musk or Bezos or anybody like that, but I have talked to other CEOs in the space industry, and there are definitely some who are really concerned about bringing diversity, bringing equity to space, making it better than it is here. And then there's others who are looking more at it from sort of I want to get away from regulations and I want to get away from rules. And right now, you can't sort of just launch on your own. You do still have to have state approval to launch. So like right now, the FAA has removed Virgin Galactic's ability to launch while they're investigating certain issues with their prior launch. So I think there are some limits if somebody is going out there with the intent to exploit or the intent to, have abhorrent conditions or create sort of indentured servitude. I think states can come in and say, no, you're not going to be allowed to launch. So there is some control there. But once again, when you're that far out there, how do you enforce these rights, even if they're there on paper? And I think that's really the concern. So there is talk about maybe we need to create judicial systems or new types of court systems on the moon, on Mars, or at different places as we get farther out there, so that you're not trying to enforce your rights back on Earth, which just isn't feasible.
So whose rule of law applies? Because you have the United States. It's not like Antarctica. Like Antarctica is kind of divvied up, right? And so you can't divvy up the Milky Way. How do you although some may try.
Yeah, some may try. I'm sure there's some who are already thinking about it that way.
I mean, like, what is the role of the United Nations? We have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Is it British common law? Is it, whose law is going to be applied in space?
And so right now, that's sort of the issue, is because there is no international law. So pretty much all the spacefaring nations signed on to the Outer Space Agreement, which just sort of lays out some very general principles. And then most of them have also signed on to a liability convention, which basically is, if you launch something, you're responsible if it causes damage. So I think most people understand those, and they've agreed to that.
Yeah.
So, but there's this beautiful agreement called the Moon Agreement, which basically created these international commons on the moon and reinforced that, you can't really do harm to it. You have to cooperate with each other. But Russia, China, and America have not signed on to that. So I think we have to look at some of these earlier agreements. And I think the best thing we can do now is sort of take what we have and sort of figure out a way to apply the laws of the different countries that are launching to whoever goes in space. So if you look at the liability convention, and there's also a registration convention where you're required to register everything you launch into space. So if we look at those two, it's very similar to maritime law, where you have to register your ship to a country and their laws apply to you. And they're also supposed to be able to extend their jurisdiction over you and make sure there's safety and things like that.
So aren't we going to have all these ships, have a jurisdiction to a country that's very favorable to whatever shenanigans they want to do?
And that's unfortunately where that might end up, where people go and they try to register their country to some place that doesn't have good labor laws, or who allows exploitation, or who doesn't care about preserving natural sort of space environment. And that is the problem, is we don't have an overriding thing. And that's the issue with all international law, is it's only as strong as the countries that are willing to agree to it. So if you don't have buy-in from the spacefaring countries, it's not going to be an effective agreement, because it's optional, basically. So I think it goes back to states being able to control who launches. So let's say you want to launch from the United States, but you want to register your ship to a country that has completely different labor laws and allows you to make people work 80 hours a week with no problem and no overtime. Well, America can say, well, you're not going to launch from our soil. Or if you launch from our soil, you're going to have to follow American rules and jurisdiction. You have to register with us to launch. So I think there's some ways to do that. I also think to some extent, public pressure is going to make a difference too, at least initially, because we've seen companies change their policies or change where they do business based on public pressure, or based on lobbying. So I think there's that possibility too. And then I think people who go to space are also going to have to make informed decisions themselves. Like if you're signing up for a space mission and it's saying, like, by the way, you're going to be governed by these terrible laws, you may have to say, no, I'm not going to. I'm not going to work for a company that's putting out there on its face that they're going to exploit me. But that is a hard thing for people to do, because there's going to be such a desire, I think, to go to space.
So people need to be aware of the protections or lack thereof. And what do you do if, you go up and you have a job, and this happens here on Earth as well, and it turns out not to be what you want, either because you decide that you want to move on, or it's not a good work environment for you, or there, whatever variety of issues that cause people to resign from a position.
Yeah. And that's difficult, because we're used to, like, at least in California here, we're very used to at-will relationships where either party can be like, I'm done with this working relationship, goodbye. You're not really going to be able to do that in space. And it's something employers have to consider too. If you make the conditions so horrible that people aren't going to work, what are you going to do with this person who's on a 3-year mission and just decides to stop working, or decides to stop communicating with you? You're kind of at a loss too. You might lose millions, if not billions of dollars, because you made it so difficult that their only choice was to say, well, I'm basically mutinying. And there was actually a situation back in the 1970s. It's sort of referred to as a mutiny. And then other people say, no, it was just a miscommunication. There's no mutiny. But on the predecessor to the ISS, there was a crew that went up to the space station from America. And when they got up there, they were, reporting back to mission control on Earth, our schedule is just not working for us. Like, we don't have enough rest time. We don't have days off. We don't have time between tasks to prepare for the next one. We just can't keep up with the schedule. Like, it's not working for us, and it's just too much work. And they were largely ignored, and their concerns were just sort of brushed off. But then they just didn't communicate for a whole cycle around the Earth. And there's a question as to whether this was accidental or just a scheduling issue, or whether it was intentional. But when they did reestablish communication, lo and behold, they were able to get those schedule changes that they needed. They got a day of rest, they got more time off, they got a better schedule where they had that break, and they were able to really, like, move from task to task and prepare the next stage. So I do think that there is sort of a power dynamic there too, where employees can just go, okay, well, what are you going to do? You're back down on Earth. I'm on the ship. I'm on Mars. You're going to have to listen to me, at least for now. So I do think there is that dynamic both ways, that the relationship, you have to have trust between both the employer and the employee, because you're stuck in these relationships for potentially years on end. And you don't want someone who's going to stop doing work for you or perhaps be a danger to your ship or your other crew members. So you have to figure out ways to make things work together.
So say I'm a space tourist. What kind of, how am I vulnerable then? Because I'm not an employee of the space company. I'm just along for the ride. What rights do I have in that scenario?
Right. And so I think it's going to be probably very similar to sort of all those waivers you sign when you when you go on like spaceships or go to amusement parks or things like that, which we don't even notice anymore that we're signing half the time. But I do think you are going to be waiving a lot of your rights, which is kind of, you know, I think that's the risk of going to space, and people sort of forget how risky going to space can be. And I think it's important that people get informed about it, and the companies should also be informing people of the risks. But we're definitely seeing that, you know, in the past, astronauts had to meet these very, very high health regulations. Basically, you had to be incredibly fit, sort of the top of all of your physical performance peaks. You couldn't have any sort of underlying conditions. Even sometimes food allergies was enough to get you bumped from being an astronaut. And I think we're going to see that change a lot with private astronauts, and it's going to open up a lot more. So with that, of course, it's great opening up more accessibility, but you're also going to have people who may suffer more from what happens in space. So I think having that communication is really important. And I think we also have to remember that in the past, astronauts were mostly government employees, and so they got healthcare for their life pretty much when they return. That's part of the deal as a government employee. For a space tourist or a private space employee, you don't get health insurance when you come back from space. So you are sort of exposing yourself to much greater risks, especially down the line, of things like cancer. And I think that's something that needs to be adequately communicated and compensated, because I think there's an issue there where you might not be able to get health insurance as a private citizen if you've been to space or you've been exposed to certain levels of radiation, things like that. And that's,
so space might be a pre-existing condition.
I could see insurance companies arguing that for sure.
Right.
Yeah, because they try to argue that whenever they can. So why not? Why not this?
Wow. So, you know, so I'm just looking at our notes about this, and it's just like, oh, this seems like once again the technologists, innovators are running ahead, where they're going like, ooh, we can make money and we can make cool things and all that. And the people who are thinking about potential harms, ethical issues, and so on are like way behind, going like, wait. And they're like, no, don't worry about it. It's not gonna be a problem. And it makes me a little bit nervous. It makes me a lot nervous that like, we've seen this movie so many times.
I think there's a lot of people.
How will it be different this time?
I mean, I think there's a lot of people thinking about these issues right now and talking about them in the international law and the international space community. But I do think there's a lot of people who are saying, well, this isn't an issue now. Like we don't have people in space. We don't have a moon base. Why are you raising these issues until we have it? But I think we need to plan in advance for this so that people know, and not wait until something goes terribly wrong and then try to figure out the law for it. So I do think there are people working on this and trying to figure it out. I do think that those are not necessarily the same people who are going out and exploring and building things, but I do think there are a lot of private companies that are conscious about this, in particular looking at just enforcing their rights. You know, if I make something on the moon, do I get to keep the IP for it? Well, maybe you'd like to work on jurisdiction issues so that you can also protect your rights. So I think that that's sort of a dual relationship that everyone should be interested in. I do know that there is some conversation that there's a concern of over legislating, particularly in America, that if we set out these rules and we make it as strict as it is on Earth, or stricter, which it probably has to be for the additional concerns, that people are just going to go and launch from another country. So I think there is sort of a balancing dance going on right now, because there isn't sort of an international system for this yet. It's still state by state.
You know, that argument would not pass muster with my mother. You know, but everyone else gets to, and mom would say, like, I don't care whether everyone else can go jumping off a cliff, you don't get to.
Yeah, and it's definitely something states are going to have
The
to
FOMO argument, right?
Yeah,
The fear of
it's
missing out.
like if I don't like my answer from mom, I'm going to go to dad and hope there's a difference.
Right. Well, but they're good. But I want to go and hang out with the kids who are going to do the bad thing. If you're not going to let me do it, you want me to be good. I can't be good, so I'm going to go be bad. Really?
Yeah, it's not a strong argument, but I think that's sort of the balance that we have right now, with private companies really dominating this new sort of race back to space, is that you are sort of balancing these interests, where previously, when it was more closed off, you were able to set the rules better.
And I'm just thinking, I always think about the value systems or the implicit beliefs of any innovator, because it's always embedded in whatever they create, whether or not we realize that. And certainly in Silicon Valley, there's certainly a libertarian bent, right? Which is, you know, anti-state or post-state and this and that. And so it would seem to me that space would be like libertarian heaven, because you could do anything you want.
There's definitely a large chunk of private space founders and owners that do have a libertarian bent. And if you go into any sort of clubhouse room or any online forum, you definitely do see that. I think the less vocal group that's still there is looking at this more like this is something where we can do things better and not just sort of get away from thing. They're looking sort of at a long-term growth of, okay, how do we make this a sustainable society, or how do we keep preserve issues like, and there is sort of a tension between the two. But I have talked to founders, and oftentimes they are women or people of color, and they have a very different perspective about what space is, especially because women and people of color have been largely left out of space in the past. If you look back at what our background of astronauts, it's pretty much all white men. And there have been women and there have been some people of color, but just not to the same level. And so I think they have a different perspective on what space can be.
So how can we make sure that we don't recreate the worst of our past, of humanity's past in space, except at scale? And actually, I think it would be tragic that we've made so much progress in human rights on Earth, just to lose it in space, right? And to have something that would be regressive, because we're trying to undo, again, the harms of colonialism, of exploitation, even environmental protection. You know, what happens if we should find, you know, what happens that moment when we encounter intelligent life? You know, when Columbus goes to North America and says, oh God, there are people there.
I think we're far away from that, but I don't think that means that we shouldn't protect space either. A lot of our environmental law concepts are really founded on the, okay, we want to preserve this plant life or this animal life, and not really just looking at the overall beauty of nature, whether it's devoid of life or not. And I think that's a big issue too. There's so many people who look at the moon or the Mars or other places, other celestial bodies, and they're like, well, it's just a rock. Who cares what we do? And I strongly disagree with that. And I think we have to look ahead to what we're preserving of space for future generations, because everything we're doing to space, it sort of it alters it for all time. So we have to consider, you know, what do we want to leave in the future and what do we want to preserve, because these are still amazing, beautiful places, even if they don't have life on them, or life that we consider intelligent or you know, functional, or if it once had life, doesn't have it anymore. And I think that's an issue too. And there's also the fact that so many celestial bodies have such cultural significance for different communities around the globe. So there's a growing community talking about a dark and quiet skies, basically, which means we want to preserve the stars. We want to preserve being able to see the moon and not have it lit up all the time, or put satellites orbiting around the Earth that are going to basically, ruin our view of the skies, because it has such a meaning, and it has had a meaning for millennia on Earth. So I think those are some concerns, and I think that group is definitely becoming more vocal, and more people are listening to them and thinking about, okay, how can we incorporate these concerns along with commercial development? But I think the best way to really get these issues across is to have people talk about them and be more informed, and have the public really make a consensus and statements about what they think is important and what we need to preserve. So many people just, once again, keep thinking like this years and years out in the future, but we are going back to the moon before, like, within the next couple of years. Like, we are going to be there. I think the plan now is 2024. So, this is not
right around the corner.
Future world. It's here now, and we need to talk about it.
So it sounds like, and certainly this is the key thing in aviation for safety, is you need to have a flight plan, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the flight plan is basically, you know exactly what you're going to do at every step of the journey. And if you're assuming, okay, within 500 feet, I'm going to get liftoff, and then, I expect to get to this point. And if I don't, lift off at that point, then I have a plan B. So you're constantly branching and looking. It's like, if this happens, I can move forward. But if it doesn't happen, then this is my, my safe landing, or this is what I do because something went wrong. And you're anticipating all of that. So it sounds like we need to have that same kind of a mindset of having a flight plan when it comes to human rights and the law and all of that. And certainly, in terms of what does it have to do with peace? Well, I mean, wherever people are, we have to think about having a flight plan for creating a peaceful society.
Yes.
Right? Otherwise, we're just going to, as the Buddhists say, as Buckaroo Banzai says, no matter where you go, there you are. So if we're not mindful of that, we will just bring all our old problems into a new space.
No, and I agree. I think that's why we need to start talking about this now, and not wait until we already have a space hotel orbiting the Earth, or we've already sent people to Mars. I think we need to figure out how we're going to handle this now and build those systems around it. So, figuring out how we're even going to deal with simple things like, how are we going to deal with time on Mars? Like, it doesn't follow the same thing as Earth, the hours.
Oh, tell me more. That's a tiny thing. So tell me more about time.
So we're very structured into this idea of like 24 hours a day, 7 days in a week. And that's just sort of how we think about time on Earth. But a day on the moon is 700 Earth hours long.
What?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Well, from the sunrise to sunset kind of thing, it's 700 Earth hours long.
Ooh, that's a long day.
Yeah. And Mars is only 25-hour Earth hours long, so not a humongous difference, but its year is twice as long, basically. So how do we break up things when we're no longer thinking in sort of this 24/7? Like on the moon, maybe we'll just ignore what's happening and sort of still stick with Earth time because we're so close. But on Mars, that's not necessarily going to make sense. So I think we have to start even thinking of how we're going to deal with time. Are we just going to transplant a 40-hour work week to living out in space, even if 40 hours isn't really the same as it is back on Earth? So I think just even simple things like that we need to think about. And they didn't need to think about it so much with government exploration, because it's sort of like being in the military. You just kind of follow whatever rules are laid out for you, and that's it. But civilians have very different concerns and are used to different things, and it's different from being in the military. So we really do need to think about these things.
So it's curious because the 40-hour work week is something that came out of the Industrial Revolution to save you from the 80-hour work week and say, no, the 40-hour work week is sane. And now we have the whole gig economy and the whole, the great interrupt that COVID has been in terms of everyone working remotely and working from home and setting their own hours. So even the whole notion of a 40-hour work week is a bit up in the air now for so many people.
Right. And it's also partially based on the idea that they thought that if you worked more than 40 hours, you weren't going to be, it's damaging to your health, but you're not as productive as you once were. So that's something that definitely we have to think about, because if we get rid of that, are we going to come up with new terms? Are they going to be better? Are they going to be worse? Is it really going to be based on what we decide is, scientifically the best amount of time for someone to work, or certain allotments? And in space, you're also kind of always on call, because an emergency can come up at any time. And emergencies there aren't like, oh no, we have to file something. It's like, oh no, the spaceship has a problem. Like, we need to do this to survive. So I think that those are issues that we haven't really dealt with in this yet. And I think that's a big concern. I think privacy is a humongous concern in space, because you have to monitor health so much more than you do on Earth. You have to monitor how much someone eats, how much someone drinks, whether they're sleeping, what medications they're on. All those things have to be monitored to make sure that you have enough supplies, that 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 you're not endangering other members of the crew. It's so many things like that.
Oh, now I'm just thinking of the mental health issues.
And that's one of the things is, in the past, the astronaut screening really sort of takes out anyone who might be dealing with any sort of real serious mental health issues. But as we expand farther, you're definitely going to have people who are like everyone else. They may have problems here and there. And how will that work in space? We're not sure yet.
Right. I mean, we have a bad enough problem with mediating technologies like Instagram and Snapchat in terms of mental health, as the Facebook research revealed. Instagram, suicidal ideation among adolescent women, and so on. And can you imagine that that scrutiny in this artificial environment where everyone's keeping tabs on everyone else through these mediating technologies and on all this data gathering? If we can barely keep it together, because of an Instagram influencer who uses a filter.
Yeah, how are you gonna, like, when somebody's like, well, it looks like you had a little bit more to eat today, or
yeah, or whatever. This constant micro scrutiny, and we're all looking at our necks now on Zoom, going like, oh God, I need to get this worked on.
No, but it is like, you will be under so much more scrutiny than you're used to being in space. And a lot of it is because of safety concerns. So balancing that. And another thing that just what you're saying reminded me of is the ability to communicate too, because the farther you get out in space, there's a time gap in communication. And it also just gets harder to send back information or to process it back to Earth. So you're not going to be able to have, a simultaneous phone call or a text chat or anything like that. There's going to be such a delay, and you're going to be, the amount of bandwidth you're given or your access to communications are going to be controlled by basically whoever controls the spaceship, and probably mission control back on Earth. So you're also going to have issues with people being able to have private communications with their family and friends on Earth, or even just being able to access communicating back to Earth, because there are going to be limitations on that too, and the possibility for it just to be completely shut off. So I think that's also an issue too.
Right, because everyone suffered from Zoom fatigue. The researchers at Stanford are talking about the sync between your voice and the visual, and how it's just slightly off, and your brain is working, double time to reconcile it and make sure that makes sense. But then if you're out in Mars And talk about bad Wi-Fi. And
Yes.
you're so like, you're watching the thing spin and go like, oh, poor connection. And you go like, oh crap, not again. I mean, it's aggravating enough, in Palo Alto, much less on some station out there.
But I think all of these issues just create such a potential for negative dynamics. There's a potential for incredibly positive growth, I think, but there's also a potential for there to be so much conflict because you are so isolated and you are going to be away for such a long period of time and sort of beyond the bounds of what we consider normal control or normal access to what you're used to. So I do think there is so much potential for disputes to become bigger than they would on Earth.
Wow. Wow. So the task and the challenge is, how do we create peace in space? Right? And how do we do it? Because it could be like your worst dystopian science fiction novel.
And I think part of it is everybody has to realize that, especially in space, you're going to have to rely on each other. So who has the most money isn't going to matter when you're out there trying to get oxygen, trying to survive, trying to make a place habitable that is not remotely habitable for humans. And I think people really need to sort of look at this as a chance for people to work together, because yes, you might be able to exploit someone, but that's not going to work in the long run. You're not going to have more people who want to go out into space, or you're going to deal with somebody who's then going to sabotage what you're working on. So we really have to think about this as a cooperative enterprise where we do have to all work together for this to succeed.
So, interesting. So if you look at this as, in terms of designing the game, this is a massively cooperative game, collaborative game. And if one fails, everyone fails. I don't know. I love cooperative games because that is the point of the rule set. Is like, oh, wait a minute, in a 4-player game, the first person died, game over. It's like, oh, we never got off the planet. We never were able to put the puzzle together because poof, that was it. And space is the real, it's not a game, but it is the game. It is the ultimate cooperative game.
Definitely. And I think it also, we're not going to be able to think of it as sort of, you did this and I don't have to, like, if you're unable to do this or if you're unable to complete this task, well, I'm not going to do it. You have to also have crews that are going to work together, because there are going to be times when somebody is going to have difficulty with something as simple as space sickness, or just not being able to deal with that fact of being separated for years from their family and friends. Like, they think they'll be able to handle it. As we discovered in lockdown, a lot of people cannot handle being in their homes 24/7, not going out and getting to see friends. So I think you're going to also have to have people that are willing to help each other and also willing to help out. So you can't just sort of look at your own task and go, well, I did A, it's up to you guys to do B and C. No, everyone will have to work together.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll have to pick up the slack for somebody and they'll have to pick it up for you at another time. And I think that's a very different mindset than a lot of us have, who haven't worked or lived in sort of one of those sort of communal settings where everybody helps each other. Because that is really what you'll need, at least initially.
Right. So this is going to be very interesting. I don't know if you know the history of Jamestown. So it's, they put together a corporation, they sent these men out. And so the first expeditions were just men. So the first Jamestown expedition failed. Okay, they sent all these men out. It was a great history.
There's just too many jokes. They're just right there at the front. I know. I'm sorry.
They were they met the native people. They said, "Oh, great! Oh, free food, excellent." They didn't grow anything. They didn't prepare. They were just waiting, and basically they all starved to death. And they did this like one or like maybe 2 times, and then like the third time they said, "We got to send women." And so when they sent enough women, it wasn't like 50-50, but they sent enough women where the women said, dude, You got to chop the wood, otherwise we're going to freeze to death. And then they were able to survive and make it work. But they had to change the model of how they did those colonies.
It's interesting because I was talking to a founder of a company that sort of puts together space teams for missions or crews for missions. And we were talking about how in the past, astronaut crews were sort of like all alpha males, all alpha white males. And there's sort of this skewed analysis that like, well, that's the ideal team because it's worked before in the past. But we've never had really sort of those long, in-depth missions on the moon. Like somebody hasn't been there for months and months and months. And we haven't sent someone out for like 2-3 years into space. And they were talking about how, and it's also obvious from business point of view, but having a much more diverse crew where you have people filling different roles and balancing each other out. So having women, having people of color, having people with disabilities, all of those things can factor in to make a much stronger crew than what we think of as sort of like the alpha male astronaut crew. And even just and we haven't had a really fully diverse crew, so you haven't been able to actually prove the data on this. But when you do sort of experiments in other circumstances, sort of like the mock astronaut experiments or in Arctic expeditions or desert expeditions, they have found that more diverse crews do better. And if you look in the business setting, we know for a fact that companies that have diverse leaders, diverse boards of directors, they do better in the long run. They're more profitable, they're more stable. And I think we need to start thinking about that too. And I think it's not just diversity or equity because we think that's a good thing or a nice thing to have. It's a better thing because you get people who are looking at things from different issues, who are focused on maybe the non-fun part of like, oh, let's chop wood so we don't freeze to death versus like, let's go out and fight or let's go out and name a new rock. You have like that sort of more practical experience. And I think that's going to be a humongous reason that we do see more diversity because you do need a balanced crew. You can't just have everyone be the captain of a ship. You need a mixed group.
And we know that for all the D&D players out there, they know that as well.
Yes.
Not everyone can be a warrior.
Yeah, it's like you need that elf or something, and
maybe
healer.
a wizard and a, yeah, exactly. So where do we go from here? I mean, for people who are listening and who want to understand more, what would your call to action be to them? Because right now it seems like space exploration is the billionaire boys club. And what they're doing doesn't have much to do with me. I read that and either I'm a fanboy or a fangirl of what they're doing or not. But it sounds like it's more like there's more, like we have more skin in the game than we realize if we care about. And I know in prior conversations, I've talked to people about how do we be a good ancestor. And so if we want to be a good ancestor for the humans that are kind of come, 100 years from now, we're going to be living in space. How can we make sure that we set the preconditions that they're living in a safe and just society?
And I think some of what we see in space does have impacts on Earth. I mean, from simple things like just the amount of space debris and how that can fall to Earth and cause problems to just the potential for more resources to come to Earth. So I do think that what happens in space does affect Earth and vice versa. But I think there are ways to get involved. There's a lot of international organizations that are talking about different space issues and people can become part of that. I know I keep talking about Just Ad Astra, but that's one of them. But there's also different groups that there's like a Moon Society group too that's sort of focused on developing the moon to be a sort of communal space for everyone. There's other groups that focus on accessibility to space and to making sure, for example, that countries that have been left out of these decisions before are included. Particularly Africa has pretty much always been excluded from space conversations, despite the fact that it obviously impacts them as well. So making sure these countries that have been ignored before have a voice and have an opportunity and have equal access to space. I think there's different ways to do that. And I think NASA's been a lot more transparent, especially I feel like now everything's even more transparent than normal because everything's online. But there are opportunities there to talk and speak with different people within the organization to comment on plans and things like that. We also, you're always able to talk to your congressmen and your senators about the funding that's happening, because I mean, that's become a huge issue of who's getting the funding for these space missions, because private companies are getting paid by the United States government to help fund these missions. So that's a great opportunity to also talk there and make sure that the money is going to companies and organizations that you believe are creating a more equitable future and who aren't just going to exploit it.
How do we put positive pressure on these private companies that they incorporate human rights in the culture and practice of their space exploration?
I think we have to approach it the same way we do for other entities. And I know it's a little bit harder. You can't really like boycott SpaceX. That doesn't make sense because we're not going in, most of us are not paying for a flight anyway or are going to be part of it. But there are ways to sort of exert that pressure in other ways, to talk about it openly, to ask them to sign pledges, to ask them to actually put someone on their staff who is going to look into these issues, to make commitments moving forward. And we have seen companies be pressured into making changes. I think some of the most effective things that we've seen have definitely been within the LGBTQ community, really forcing companies to take a stance and take a position and fight for LGBTQ rights. And I think we can use a lot of those same techniques to make sure that space companies are also looking at all of these issues and not just looking to make a profit.
Great. Alyson, you are such a resource. My mind was just blown because I never considered these issues. And of course, it's like, of course, we have to think about ethics. We have to think about human rights in space, as we do with AI, as we do with any new technology. This is always there. And you are, as Chris Bennett, my game designer in residence, said, you're at the tip of the spear, my friend. You're at the tip of the spear as you're thinking about these things. And I'm so thrilled to have gotten to know you, and that it's a voice of a woman who's, saying these things need to be addressed. We need to talk about them. Thank you so much for spending the hour with me here.
Well, it was great chatting with you. I always love getting a chance to talk about space because I think it's not only exciting, but I think it's really important. And I think it's something that we can shape for generations to come. And I hope we shape it positively.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.